All right, let's talk about suing the government. Imagine for a second if you could sue for every single mistake it made. I mean, it would be total chaos, right? But on the flip side, what happens when a government mistake actually causes you serious, real-world harm? That's the tricky middle ground we're going to explore today. It's a legal idea called the discretionary function exception, and it all comes down to one big question. When can you really sue the government?
So, let's just imagine this for a second. A federal agency makes a mistake, and it hurts you directly. Your first thought is probably, of course I can sue. You should be able to hold them accountable, right? Well, as we're about to find out, it's just not that simple.
Yeah, the short answer, it's complicated. And the reason why it goes way, way back to this old idea called sovereign immunity. I mean, the simplest way to put it is you can't sue the king. But, and this is a huge but, there are some really important exceptions to that rule, and that's where things start to get interesting.
So let's really dig into that. We're going to unpack exactly where that line is drawn. Where does the government's protection stop and its responsibility to you actually begin?
And believe it or not, it all boils down to this fundamental split, this difference between two very distinct types of government actions. Is someone just following a strict rulebook, or are they making a judgment call? Okay, so think of it like this. On one side, you have what are called ministerial acts. These are the absolute must-dos, the non-negotiables. An employee has to do it, no questions asked. And on the other side, you've got discretionary acts, and that's all about weighing options and making a choice. Seriously, understanding this one distinction is the key to this whole thing. Let's take a ministerial act. The best way to think about it is like a baker who's following a super specific recipe. If that recipe says, add 1 cup of flour, the baker doesn't get to use their best judgment and toss in 2. Nope, it's a specific, mandatory instruction. There's zero choice involved.
But a discretionary act, well, that's like telling that same baker, hey, go invent a totally new dessert. Now, they have to use their judgment, right? They're relying on their experience, their own personal policy on what makes a cake taste amazing. That is a discretionary choice.
So where did this big dividing line even come from? I mean, they didn't just pull it out of thin air. It was actually hammered out in the courts, and it really came down to 2 landmark Supreme Court cases.
Yep, these are the big ones. Berkovitz versus United States in 1988, and then United States versus Geber in 1991. These 2 cases are basically the foundation for the rule we have today. They're the ones that created the 2-part test courts still use to sort all this stuff out. Okay, so the main takeaway from Berkovitz is absolutely crucial. Let me translate the legalese for you. Basically, the Supreme Court said that if there's a specific, mandatory rule and a government employee just ignores it, well, the government can't just hide behind the discretion excuse. Why? Because they broke their own rule. And then, just a few years later, the Gabbert case came along and added another really important layer. It made it clear that even the day-to-day operational type decisions can be protected as long as they are, and this is the key phrase, susceptible to policy analysis. So what does that mean? It means if an employee has to weigh competing things like, say, safety versus cost, their decision is probably going to be protected. Okay, so that's all the legal theory. But what does this actually look like in the real world? Let's get into some examples, because this is where it really starts to click. All right, picture an FAA's safety checklist for an airplane. That list is not a bunch of friendly suggestions, it's mandatory. So if an inspector just decides to skip a required check, well, that's not a judgment call. That's a flat-out failure to follow a specific directive. In a case like that, yeah, the government could absolutely be on the hook. But now, let's look at the flip side. What about the FAA's decision on how to use its inspectors? They have a limited budget, a limited number of people. So deciding which airports get more attention or which types of planes to prioritize, that's a huge policy judgment. It's all about balancing budgets, risks, logistics. See? That's a discretionary act, and it's protected. Here's another one. A USDA meat inspector. Let's say the rule book is crystal clear. You must perform test X before you stamp this meat as approved. If that inspector just stamps it anyway without doing the test, well, they've just violated a non-negotiable rule. And once again, that means liability is definitely on the table. Okay, now for a slightly trickier one. Let's say the National Park Service has to decide whether or not to put up a Beware of Bears sign at a particular trailhead. There's no step-by-step manual for that, right? They have to weigh the actual risk, the cost of the sign, maybe even how it affects the natural beauty of the park. That's a policy choice. It's a discretionary act. And in that case, no liability. So when you take a step back from all these examples,
You might be asking, why does this exception even exist in the first place? Well, it's all about trying to strike this incredibly delicate balance. You want to give the government the freedom it needs to actually govern, but you also need to hold it accountable when it messes up.
So what are the big takeaways here? Let's just sum it up. First, the government can be held accountable when it fails to follow its own clear black and white rules. Those are the ministerial acts. But second, it's protected when it's making those tough policy judgments, the discretionary acts. It really all comes down to that one question. Was there a specific rule they had to follow, or did the situation involve choice and judgment? And that, right there, is the core tension of this whole thing. On the one hand, we need our government agencies to be able to make tough, complex decisions without being totally paralyzed by the fear of a lawsuit around every corner. But on the other hand, we have to have a way to protect people when an agency is just plain negligent, when it ignores its own mandatory safety rules.
This whole legal doctrine is an attempt to draw that line in the sand. But it leaves us with a huge question, doesn't it? Is that line in the right place? I mean, what is the perfect balance between giving the government freedom to act and making sure the public is protected? It's a fundamental question, and there's definitely no easy answer.